Okay, so Steve, are you there? And you could start sharing your screen. Once you're set up, I will mute myself.
Cool. Can you guys see this screen, by the way? Just to make sure. Cool.
Yes, it's on the left side, though. We can still see the,
You guys.
small ones.
Let me presenter mode. I guess you guys you can see yourself there. Can you see yourself?
Oh, perfect. Now you're good.
Perfect.
You're all good. We can see you. I'm going to mute. If you have any issues, just let me know.
Yeah. So Donna, thank you for inviting me to give this talk today. And thank you for everyone here for actually your time. And hopefully you learned something today. And for the questions thing, if you have any questions, type it out in the chat, and then we could, as in real time, type it out in chat so you don't forget, and then we could go back to it after the presentation. I'll definitely have time for questions. So I think Donna introed me. I'm Steve Mason. I'm an first-year assistant professor at Immaculata University. It's really very much a dream job. I get to teach about stuff that I'm passionate about and that I love, while also continuing to do research, which is also one of my passions. Before I get into the talk, though, I have to shout out Jack Connor. I don't know if any of you guys know Jack Connor, but he was my undergraduate professor. He's now in charge. He's very involved in NABA counts in South Jersey. He's in charge of the South Jersey Butterfly Log. But I was actually a psychology major until I took one of his classes and then switched to environmental science. There's actually a whole story with that, but point is Jack Connor literally changed the course of my life. And then there's me right here in his first class. I still wear my hats tilted. But also another important person that was in my life in early career, it's Tom Reed. So I don't know if you know the name Tom Reed. He was back then a hotshot Cape May birder, and he's still a pretty good birder to this day. But he grew up on Reed's Beach in Cape May County, and he was a birder. And like most birders, they look at butterflies too. And Jack Connor changed my career direction, but Tom was really influential in, I want to say, nurturing it. So we would go out birding all the time. He knew all the stuff. I was new to it. But one of these days, he invited me to my first NABA butterfly count. It was in 2007. It was the Cape May butterfly count. And literally the first butterfly, I mean, I've seen butterflies as a kid, but actually looking for butterflies, the first one that I saw was actually an American copper. And I took a photo of it, and that's the butterfly. And I even was like, Tom, is this a butterfly? And he looked at me like, of course it is. But it was so small. And like, not having a nature background, I think butterflies are these big things. And then my second butterfly was a broad-winged skipper on sweet pepperbush. And then Tom was trying to explain to me how skippers are hard to identify. Broad-winged skipper is bigger than most, but I had no sense of like how sizes were with skippers and stuff like that. And then anyway, so NABA counts, definitely, I mean, Tom brought me to the NABA counts in South Jersey, and they really opened my eyes to insects. And I really wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Jack Connor switching my career course and Tom Reed, who really nurtured my interests that I had. Because if Tom wasn't giving me his time and showing me birds and plants and insects, I probably wouldn't be here today to give a talk to you guys. And I do have to shout out, because I did see some familiar names in the chat. In 2009, I actually went to the Sussex County butterfly count. So I saw Sharon and Wade in the chat. Chris Williams, I still remember you. Jim Springer, I remember you too. And Chris Hertz, I saw you guys. So you guys all, you're in my memory. And the Sussex butterfly count was definitely something new. We don't have hills in South Jersey. And I definitely do my research, and my heart belongs to the Pine Barrens. And you guys have trees that the leaves fall off every winter. So it was really good experience. And I just have to give a shout out to NABA, because again, I wouldn't be here if you didn't have opportunities for people to butterfly watch and to get outside and to get into nature. So keep up what you guys do. And I say that from the bottom of my heart. So today's program, I had a recent paper that came out in Biological Conservation. So this is a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and you may or may not know, but scientific journals have impact factors. And this, in the conservation world, is one of the highest impact factor conservation journals in the world. And I hope I didn't say that conceitedly, but I say that because this is something that took 2 years to do. And it's probably one of my proudest accomplishments academically that I've done so far. And my goal today is, it took 2 years to do, and I'm going to run it through with you guys in like 45 minutes. So my goal is to literally run through the paper with you. This is open access. So to give you guys a sense of what the paper is about, and if you want to explore it further, learn more, you could email me, message me, but you could also check out the paper yourself. And that's the main goal that I want you guys to do, is to get a sense of the paper. So if you want to learn more about it, you could do it on your own. So anyway, so moving on. This paper couldn't have done, again, it took 2 years to do. I have to thank my co-authors, Von Shirey, a PhD candidate at Georgetown, Dr. Lauren Panisio, University of Oregon, and John Gelhaus at Drexel University, but also the curator of the Academy of Natural Sciences. I see a cat in the right part of my right screen, and I am also new cat dad, by the way, rescue cat dad, by the way. Anyway, so moving on to the actual paper. So why is studying fire important? Please forgive me because I am actually going to read this word for word for you guys, but it really, going through the peer-reviewed literature, it really sat with me. But wildfires have shaped our world since long before humans emerged. We cannot understand our biota, like butterflies, in terms of adaptations and ecosystem distribution without including fire as a process in the natural history of our planet. And I say that because every terrestrial habitat literally had some type of fire. It's just a matter of the fire frequency, right? Fire frequency in the New Jersey Pine Barrens is a lot higher than the boreal forests in Canada, right? But everywhere had fire. All the animals, including butterflies, had to deal with fire in their evolutionary history. So if you're talking about adaptation, speciation, a lot of those terms, fire plays an important role in that. And that's why I love studying fire. And in 2015, this on the cover of Discover Magazine's paper was this picture. They were saying that fiery 2015 may become the new normal. And we're 7 years out of 2015, which is crazy to think about. But every year we're constantly hearing about fires somewhere on the planet, right? And this all has to do with global warming. If you think about it, in a nutshell, global warming, temperatures increase, right? If you have increase in temperatures, you're having higher evaporation. With higher evaporation, you're having less moisture content in the leaf litter, so fires could start faster. You're having earlier snow melt. Again, earlier snow melt means less fires. With global warming, there's less days that are raining. We're getting less rain. And this all contributes to more wildfires, not just more wildfires in frequency, but their extent, their severity, and their longevity, all because of global warming. So fires are something we have to deal with. And, you know, there's not one day that goes by without seeing fires in the news. You literally could look up fire, like current fire somewhere, and then there's always a fire burning somewhere in the world, usually out west, to be honest, even this time of year. Just in 2019 into 2020, Australia, if you recall in the news, was on fire. Australia is a fire-adapted ecosystem, but they're not used to the amount of fires they had to deal with, the extent of fires that was going on. So that, again, plays into global warming. And even in Canada in 2016, there's the Fort McMurray wildfire. That was a 1.5 million acre wildfire in the boreal forest of Canada. They get fires, like I said, but not at this extent and not at this severity. Again, having to do with global warming. And you guys probably know this as well, but even in the Pine Barrens, wildfires occur in the Pine Barrens every year. And in 2019 was one of the larger ones, which was 11,000 acres. And you could actually see the burn scars here in Bass River State Forest. And if you guys are familiar with Long Beach Island, here's actually Route 72 to give you a little bit perspective. And despite what Wade said, there is no such thing as Central Jersey. And I say that knowing I'm talking to North Jerseyans probably, so don't hurt me for that. But anyway, wildfires are very frequent and it all has to do with global warming, and we have to deal with them one way or another. Not just us as humans, but the species that we rely on have to deal with wildfires more as well. So one question that I always get is, Steve, why do you like insects so much? And the answer to that, the short answer to that is I'm actually fascinated by biodiversity. And I don't think it's a surprise when people learn that I like biodiversity. I went from birds. What got me into nature originally was birds. Then I went to plants, and then I went to insects. Insects are by far the most biodiverse animal group in the world. They're more biodiverse than plants. And if we see insects just dominate all the other animals when it comes to species richness, unique species. So invertebrates in general. Here, I hope you guys could see my mouse. Nod your head if you could see my mouse. Anybody? Okay, great. You could see my mouse. So if we look at, insects are invertebrates, arachnids, crustaceans, myriapods, mollusks, all these here is the life on our planet, and they're all invertebrates. And these are the vertebrates. And as a conservation biologist, when people are making management decisions to increase bird biodiversity, and I like birds, is that really the best way to go about managing something for biodiversity when birds are just such a minor thing when it comes to overall biodiversity in a community? So just food for thought when it comes out there. And biodiversity, one thing to take away from this talk is, Steve, why is biodiversity important? Biodiversity specifically leads to healthier ecosystems. Healthier ecosystems specifically lead to ecosystem function, and ecosystem function specifically leads to ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are such thing as pollination, fresh air. We cannot have pollination or fresh air without a healthy amount of biodiversity, if that makes sense. So this is the importance of biodiversity. And when you want ecosystem services, you need high biodiversity. What do you need to study? They're insects, because they are, again, the most biodiverse organism in the world. So I don't know if you guys heard about this, but there's something called the insect apocalypse. And I was actually telling my cousin about this the other day being a couple months ago. And he goes, Steve, you mean insects are actually turning into zombies? Like insect apocalypse? And I'm like, no, that's not what I mean. The insect apocalypse is there's a lot of high impact scientific peer-reviewed journals that are actually showing that insect abundances and biomass is declining over the past few decades. And again, that's a problem because insects are the most biodiverse animal group in the world. So if they're declining, our ecosystem services are at risk, and the health of our ecosystems in general are at risk. And if you're studying vertebrates, they're at risk because they're dependent on insects, right? So that's a problem, the insect apocalypse. So if we actually look at some of the papers that have the insect apocalypse, here's one that's published in Biological Conservation. They are showing the drivers of why insects are actually declining in the last couple decades. And one of the drivers that they actually mention is fire, right? Here's another high impact peer-reviewed publication. This one's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious journals that you could ever publish in the world as a scientist. And this one's by David Wagner, who does moths. You might have heard of him. But he came out with a paper called Death by a Thousand Cuts. Why are insects declining globally? One of the things that he mentioned is actually fire, right? And I could give you a half a dozen more papers on this that mention fire is one of the reasons why insects are declining globally. So my main research is the study of fire effects on insect communities. So what do we actually know about fires that are increasing with global warming and insects, which are the most biodiverse animal group in the world? And I'm not going to read these for you word for word, but if you look in the pyroentomology literature, which is a term that I've coined, which means fire effects on insect communities, there's contrasting examples reported in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. In the peer-reviewed scientific literature, results are not consistent across studies. They're limited and contradictory. There's a range of positive and negative effects in pyroentomology literature. So this means if you look in the literature on pyroentomology, there's conflicting results. I could give you 10 high impact peer-reviewed scientific publications that actually show that fires increase insect biodiversity. But on the flip side, I could give you 10 high impact scientific peer-reviewed publications that show insects are declining from fire. So there's these conflicting results. And there's literally dozens of other studies that are showing there's conflicting results in the peer-reviewed literature. And sometimes when a land manager, and I've talked to some land managers, they're like, Steve, we're going to do a prescribed fire because it's going to increase butterflies. Here are the 5 papers that show it. And I come back and I'm like, here are the 5 papers that don't show it. And that puts them in a tough position, right? So with pyroentomology, there's still a lot to learn. This is what I'm, as of right now, trying to make my name in the pyroentomology field about pyroentomology. And did I actually try and answer and solve this question? I didn't solve it about the conflicting results, but I think I advanced the field a little further, and I'm going to walk with you on how I did that, if that made sense. So as a community ecologist, we study interactions of everything in a certain community, right? And a disturbance ecology like fire, here's your forest, it's kind of like a subcategory, a subfamily, a subspecies, if you will, under community ecology. So if you have a fire in a forest, that fire could actually reduce species richness and abundance. And when I say species richness, I mean the unique species in an area. And abundance is the amount of individuals per species, right? So fire could reduce species richness and abundance. Fire could, have unchanged species richness and abundance, right? A fire won't affect richness at all or won't affect abundance at all. Or fires could enhance species richness and abundance. And species richness and abundance is the foundation of biodiversity, right? When you're talking about community composition, evenness, beta diversity, when you talk about all that stuff, it all goes back down to species richness and abundance. This is the basics of ecology when you're studying ecology and conservation. So fire, again, could reduce, enhance, or have unchanged species richness and abundance. Historically, in the community ecology literature, when you're studying fires, in the 1950s, if you read all the papers on biodiversity and fires, they look at community dynamics. What's the competition after a fire? What's the predator-prey relationship? What's the symbiotic relationships between organisms? Is it mutualism? Is it commensalism? Is it parasitic? Few decades later, we're getting into the late 90s. Scientists in community ecology after fire started looking at environmental changes. What is the resource partitioning? What is the vegetation structure after a fire? How does that vegetation structure affect butterfly richness and abundance, for example? How much sunlight's coming in after a fire? How is that affecting butterfly species richness and abundance? And now kind of the hot topic, no pun intended, is what are the tax's functional traits after a fire? Or just in any type of, after a hurricane, after a flood? When does the species mate? Are they big? Are they small? Can they run fast? What's their physiology? What's their ecology? So this is kind of the hot topic now in community ecology, is looking at species functional traits. Or what a lot of the top scientists are doing, they're looking at a combination of all these things on how butterflies, for example, are, richness and abundance are increasing or decreasing. Hope you guys are still following me. But one thing that I noticed when I'm doing my research and looking at the literature of what has been done already in the pyroentomology field is that no one's actually studying the actual fire itself, right? We're looking at, here's a fire, and it could reduce, enhance, or have unchanged species richness, and we're going to study the community dynamics, environmental changes, and the butterfly's functional traits. But really, was it a prescribed fire or wildfire? What was the seasonality of the fire, right? We ask these questions all the time. What was the habitat the fire was in? What was the severity of the fire? What was the years post-fire? And are you doing the study 2 years after the fire? Are you doing it 5 years after the fire? Are you doing 100 years after the fire, right? And also, what was the fire frequency at that one site, right? So was it one fire in 1 year? Or was it 10 fires in 1 year? Was it 5 fires in 10 years? Was it 5 fires in 7 years, right? What was the fire frequency at that site? Or a combination of these things. And how that actually goes back to species richness and abundance. And I have a slide, not in here, but these arrows, I put these arrows connected to this, and then this connected to this. And that's why I love community ecology, because everything's connected to each other, right? I took that out because it just looked very ugly and very complicated. But my point is that scientists historically has always studied the taxa that they're studying. They're studying the butterflies, they're studying the bees, they're studying the vertebrates after a fire based off of these things, but very few scientists are paying attention to what type of fire it is. I hope that made sense. So I highlighted fire severity in that last slide. This is a little bit of a digression because most of the meat of my research is on fire severity. This is the New Jersey Pine Barrens. I'm sure you guys have been there. If you haven't, you definitely should visit. And everything north of this road right here, hopefully you guys can see my mouse, everything north of this road has been under a prescribed fire. So if you look at the canopy here, it's still green. And one metric to look at fire severity, we could say low severity, middle severity, or high severity, is looking at the canopy. It's more complex than just canopy, but this is green still. So that means the fire only burned the understory, but not into the canopy, right? So low severity fire. If we look at the orange here, the needles are still there. That's why they're orange, but they all died because the fire got so hot, probably went up halfway through the tree and killed the needles because of the heat, but the needles weren't consumed. So that's a sign of a middle severity fire. And if we look in the black here, all the pitch pine trees are completely charred. All the pine needles are gone. So this would actually be a high severity fire, right? So this is a prescribed fire with 3 different fire severity types. And just to orient you, keep an eye on this dirt patch right here, if you're still with me, this dirt patch and these 2 roads, right? Dirt patch, 2 roads. And if we look at a fire severity map, here's that dirt patch right there and the 2 roads right here. Dirt patch, 2 roads. So in that last picture, we were looking out into this distance. And you could see here's the low severity fire, the middle severity fire was here, and the high severity in the black was in here. So if you look at this fire severity map in Franklin Park Preserve, Chatsworth, New Jersey, where I do most of my research, you could see that there's different fire severities. So I think any reasonable person would say, well, Steve, if you're looking at insects in a high severity fire and you're studying insects in a low severity fire, there's going to be some differences, right? I hope you guys could agree to that. If you don't, tell me why in the chat. But I think, if we're not accounting for fire severity, look at the heterogeneity of this fire, this prescribed fire in spring in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. If you're not accounting for fire severity and you put a sample in a high severity fire, in a mid severity fire, in a low severity fire, you're probably going to get some mixed results, I would bet, right? You're going to get mixed results within your study. And then when you start comparing it between studies, that's why I predict you're going to get conflicting results. And because most scientists aren't really studying their fire severity. I hope that made sense. A little bit of a digression. But anyway, so something that I'm studying, I've been studying for years throughout my graduate career. I'm still studying as a professor, but does fire positively or negatively affect insect richness and abundance, right? And that's what I'm doing with this meta-analysis. This is what I'm doing when I'm talking, the main presentation today. And I italicize positively and negatively because when fires positively affect an insect community, let's say butterflies, that means positively increases, right? Negatively would decrease. So does fire really increase or decrease insect richness and abundance? That's the overall goal of my research that I want to study. But specifically for, at least in this talk, does fire increase or decrease bee richness and abundance? Does fire increase or decrease butterfly richness and abundance? And does fire increase or decrease ground beetle richness and abundance? And just kind of a disclaimer, these are all on different taxonomic levels, right? So ground beetles is at the family level, taxonomy, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? So we'll start at the top. Butterflies are a suborder under Lepidoptera. Bees are a superfamily, and ground beetles are at the family level. So just by the way, these are major groups that we talk about, but they're all on different taxonomic levels. And I hope that made sense. I'm trying to figure out if overall fire positively or negatively affects these animals' richness and abundance, but also to take it one step further, I want to see what kind of fire will increase or decrease their species' richness and abundance. So what's the type of fire? Again, prescribed fire or wildfire. What's the seasonality of the fire? Is it the growing season or the dormant season? What's the habitat the fire is in? What's the severity of the fire? Highlighting severity there because that's my baby. What's the years post-fire? And then what's the fire frequency? So I'm betting what I'm doing in this meta-analysis, and I'll explain what a meta-analysis is, if we actually account for all these fire and site characteristics, we're probably going to get different results within each taxa and between each taxa. And that's probably why there's conflicting results in the pyroentomology literature. I hope that made sense. Let me get a drink. Okay, so moving on. Here's my methods now. That was the intro to the paper. Here's my methods. How do we handle conflicting pyroentomology results? Well, there's something called a meta-analysis. I'll just put all these slides up here. A meta-analysis is used when studies can't be generalized and conclusions can't be reached. There's thousands of papers on global warming from independent scientists from different fields, and they all conclude global warming is a thing. But in pyroentomology, studies can't be concluded that fire is bad or good for certain taxa, right? So this is why we're going to use a meta-analysis. It's basically combining all the results from every fire and butterfly, fire and bee, fire and ground beetle publication, taking their results, combining those results to have one final outcome. And that outcome is also called an effect, which is right here. So a meta-analysis is combining the effect sizes across different data sets, different publications, addressing the same question. The question being, is fire good or bad? Does fire increase or decrease butterfly richness and abundance? And I hope that made sense. And for an example of an effect size, when you think of an effect, think of if a fire burns only a 1 by 1 meter plot in the Pine Barrens, that would be a small effect. It's only a 1 by 1 meter plot, right? Small effect. But a large effect would be when a fire completely consumes 1 million acres. I mean, the Pine Barrens is about 1 million acres. That would be a very large effect, right? So you could have different effect sizes, small effect size, large effect size. That's what I'm trying to get at. Hope you guys are still following me. So in order to do a meta-analysis, you have to do a systematic review. A systematic review is basically you're looking in all the databases that you can to find every pyroentomology paper you possibly can. So I searched in Web of Science, which is the main database, to find peer-reviewed journals in ecology and conservation and entomology. I also searched Scopus, which is a very high, it's a database that has a lot of papers when it comes to conservation, ecology, and entomology. I searched these papers with certain key terms. So other scientists, if they want to double check my work, if they want to prove me wrong, if they want to prove me right, could replicate my work if they want to. I searched the Fire Research Institute library. This is a database that captures all the fire ecology research in the world that they can, not just insects, but all fire ecology research. I searched ProQuest. So ProQuest is a database that specifically looks at master's theses and dissertations. So a lot of master's theses out there and dissertation theses were not ever published in the peer-reviewed journals that these databases capture. So this is a way of me avoiding what's called publication bias. Publication bias is when you're basing your analysis just on peer-reviewed papers that have been published. There's a lot of things out there that might not have been published for whatever reason. And again, as you can imagine, there are dissertations that never got peer-reviewed published. And I found them in ProQuest. And I also searched the National Park Service database. And for whatever it's worth, they had thousands of reports on insect species lists. But there was very few ecology papers. There's only one that actually looked at fire effects on insect communities. Most of them were just species lists. So again, to do a meta-analysis, to get all the data I possibly can, to combine their results into one ultimate effect, I need to get my own data, and that's searching the peer-reviewed literature and the non-peer-reviewed literature to avoid publication bias. So once I have all those papers that I'm looking for to do my meta-analysis, I need to filter for the criteria. So I have a paper, and I need to specifically look if that paper has the things I need to see if I could use it in my meta-analysis. So the paper that I'm looking for, it needs data on species richness and abundance, right? If you're studying a butterfly, how butterflies are affected by fire, I need to know if you accounted for butterfly species richness and abundance. If you accounted for species evenness or community composition, I can't use that. I need specifically richness and abundance. They needed to include a control site. A control site is basically an unburned site. So if you have a study and you're studying a burned site, you want an unburned site to compare it to. There's reasons to have a control site, but there's also reasons not to have a control site. So if you're doing a pyroentomology study and you do not have an unburned site to compare it to, I cannot use your paper for the meta-analysis. And lastly, I need papers to report their measures of variance. So variance maybe a big word. It's basically randomness. So when you're doing a study, there's randomness in your study. You cannot account for the weather, right? If it's raining one day and not raining another day, if a deer walks through your plot, if somebody feels like cutting down a tree in your plot, that is randomness that you cannot account for. And that is basically variance. I need that variance information, standard deviation, standard error, confidence interval in that paper to do my meta-analysis. And I hope you're still following me. Here's an example of grabbing data from peer-reviewed publications. This one's by Campbell. He did research in Georgia, and this might be scary. Don't work with me. I'm gonna walk you through this. So here's the year that he did the study, 2003, right? And here's 2004. And if you look right here, here's Hesperidae. Hesperidae is the family name for skippers, right? Here's Papilionidae. Papilionidae is the family name for swallowtails, right? So here is his standard errors right here. So there's the SE. So for Hesperidae skippers, here's the burn site right here. I'm going to take his standard error for Hesperidae and his standard error for swallowtails and compare it to the control site standard error. So the control, again, is the unburned site. I hope you follow me there. This is information that I need to do the meta-analysis, right? Here's 2004. Here's Hesperidae again. Here are the skippers. Here are the swallowtails. Here's the burn site. Here's the control site. These are the numbers that I need. If the paper didn't report the randomness, there's software called a data thief, which is very legal to use. It's basically you measure their figures to get the standard error. Another way to get the standard error is to look in the supplemental data. If data is not presented in a paper, there's supplemental data that you usually could get, and that's usually the raw data that the authors collected. Raw data is basically the species list that they're making when they go out and to do a survey, or however they're doing their methods. However, the most interesting part, I think, about trying to get the standard error and the variation, that if I couldn't get it in their paper, if I couldn't get in the supplemental data, and if I couldn't get it using Data Thief, I emailed the authors, right? So it's usually like, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I'm Steve Mason. This is what I'm trying to do. I want to cite your paper. I really think it'll be great for this meta-analysis, blah, 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 blah. And when you're emailing authors, scientists, for their data, you get mixed results, as you can imagine, right? So many times I got an immediate response with data, loved it. Other times I get a hesitant response, but I still get the data, still good. Other times I get a response that says, sure, I'll look for the data, which usually have to send them a reminder email like, hey, it's been a week. Have you found that data that I could use if you still are willing to give it to me? Sometimes I get a response with no data at all, but I'm still happy that they told me like, hey, Steve, I can't find the data. Or, hey, Steve, I don't want to give you the data for X, Y, and Z. That's fine. I'm glad you're still communicating with me, right? So I'm not waiting on you. And other times emails bounce back. There are graduate students that publish something, but they still don't have that email address. So I either have to go find them on ResearchGate or I just don't find them at all, right? And then other times, I know who you are. Sometimes I get ignored from my emails after I send like a few follow-up emails. But for whatever it's worth, out of all the scientists that I contacted to see if they could give me the raw data so I could calculate the randomness from their study, over 90% of the scientists share their data with me freely for whatever it's worth. And the 10% that didn't share their data, 5% at least emailed me back and said, hey, Steve, I can't find it or I don't want to give it to you, which is fine. So that I just think is so important, that science is about sharing. Science is about building off of each other. You cannot do everything yourself. You need to share data. And I'm so grateful for the scientists that did share their data with me. And of course, they're in the acknowledgements of this paper. Lastly, once I get the raw data, I know this is methods. I know it's kind of maybe long-winded, but then I data mine the type of information that I need from the scientist paper. Was it a prescribed fire or wildfire? What was the seasonality? What was the habitat? What was the fire severity? All this stuff that I've mentioned before. But also, what was the overall fire effect? So without looking at if it's a prescribed fire or wildfire, what was the actual overall fire effect? I hope you're still with me. Hope I didn't lose you. I'm putting an equation up here. Don't get scared of it. I just wanted to show you quick. There's many equations for a meta-analysis. I specifically use Hedges G. G is what I'm looking for. G is the effect size. Remember, it could be a small effect, small fire, 1 by 1 meter plot, or a large fire, completely burned down all of the New Jersey pine barrens. That is the effect size I'm looking for. This right here is the average response of the treatment, the site that's getting burned. This part right here is the average response of the control. This is why if you do not have an unburned site, I could not use your paper because I need this information to essentially plug and chug. SD is the randomness that I was talking about. Randomness is the information that was really hard to get. And of course, the J term is the correction term, basically to normalize the data. Just wanted to throw that in there. Hope I didn't scare you, but I wanted to show you the importance of plugging and chugging and why I needed a control site and why I needed the randomness. And I used it for the meta-analysis. Okay, let me get a drink. I saw somebody drinking wine earlier too, so I was a little envious. All right, so I went through the intro, went through the methods. Here are some of the results. Here are the summary results. So when I did this systematic review and I looked for all the peer-reviewed papers that I could find or non-peer-reviewed papers that I could find, I had over 1,800 hits when I was searching all those databases, but only 292 of those hits were actually pyroentomology papers on butterflies, on bees, and on ground beetles. So needless to say, I was looking through a lot of publications that weren't things that I needed. Out of those 202 publications, I found pyroentomology literature that went back from as early as 1932. And I cut off my search term, criteria in the middle of 2019, because in science, you have to cut it somewhere, and I wanted to graduate and I wanted to get this paper out. So those are 292 papers from 1932 to 2019. In those 292 papers of pyroentomology literature, I only could use 100 of those 292. And why I couldn't use the rest? It's because maybe they didn't have the control site. Maybe I couldn't get the raw data. Maybe I couldn't find the author to get that raw data. So I used 100 papers for the meta-analysis. And for whatever it's worth, I threw this in here last minute. Out of those 100, 27 were bee paper, 40 of them were ground beetle paper, and 37 were actually butterflies. So there's about 37 fire effect on butterfly papers out of the 100 that have a control site. 83 studies were on abundance out of these 100, and 63 of them were actually on species richness. And these numbers don't add up to 100 because some papers actually studied both species richness and abundance. For whatever it's worth, it's not surprising that there's more abundance studies than there are richness studies. I tell students, I tell colleagues, I tell land managers, I tell other scientists this all the time. Just because you cannot identify, let's say, bees to species does not mean you should not do a bee study. I was just saying this at Valley Forge. Valley Forge, 5 years ago, they don't have the expertise to identify bees to species. I don't have the expertise to identify bees to species, but we all know what bees are. So let's just do an abundance study. Here are all the bees that came after a fire, and here are all the bees that came before a fire, for example. So we just did an abundance study without doing species richness. And again, that's why abundance studies are more common than species richness, because it's hard to identify things sometimes. And because I'm hyped up on fire severity, again, that's kind of the meat of my research, only 7% of the studies that we used out of these 100, only 7% of them actually quantified fire severity. So remember how I was saying that if you have different fire severities, you're going to probably have different vegetation structures. And if you're not accounting for fire severity, that's probably why you're having conflicting results. Only 7% of the studies quantified fire severity. I was one of those 7 in my Pine Barrens research. And 5 of the 7 studies that quantified their fires were recently in 2018, 2019. This is basically showing that a lot of scientists now are realizing we need to start looking at fire severity, and it almost seems like a no-brainer. So hope this made sense. If you have any questions about this, throw it in chat. Okay, out of those 100 studies, here are the locations of all those pyroentomology studies. So the orange ones are the bee studies, the pink dots are the butterfly studies, and the green dots are the ground beetle studies. The black dots basically have multiple taxa. So meaning if it's a black dot, that study did bees and butterflies, for example. There's a lot of takeaways here. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but a few takeaways that I'll mention. There's 2 countries that had studies for all 3 taxa. The United States had pyroentomology studies on bees, butterflies, and ground beetles. And the other country was actually South Africa. They had bees, butterflies, and ground beetles studies on fire effects. Second takeaway here, found no studies in Australia on bees, butterflies, and ground beetles. I have a colleague in Australia that just published a paper talking about, kind of reviewing the scientific literature on fire effects on invertebrates. And she basically said in that paper, Australians, they're more concerned with the megafauna. They want to study their crocodiles and all their other vertebrates. So that's why there's not a lot of funding that's going to the invertebrates. There are invertebrate studies out there, but just none on ground beetles, butterflies, and bees, which kind of blows my mind because these are arguably the most popular and easier insects to study when you're doing any type of entomology work. Third takeaway, didn't find any research in mainland Asia, mainland Russia. There's some comments there I'm not going to stay away from with the Ukraine, and then mainland Africa. So again, these are the locations of all the studies that I found. And quickly, I'll say, in the Northeast where we are, this orange dot here, that bee paper, well, it's not a published paper, but that's Valley Forge. We had an undergraduate student at Drexel that did a bee abundance study with their prescribed fires at Valley Forge. Where's my mouse? Right here. And that green dot right there is my ground beetle research in the New Jersey Pine Barrens with prescribed fire as well. So if I didn't know the people at Valley Forge and I wasn't doing prescribed fire research in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, the Northeast would be not have any pyroentomology research, which in my opinion is an issue. But anyway, so moving on, continuing with the results. Don't be afraid of this slide. This is the meat of the research that I'm going to talk about. This is what's called a forest plot. I am going to walk you through it very slowly. If you have any questions, put it in chat. First thing to notice, bee richness is up here. So we're talking about bees and we're talking about the unique bee richness, which is basically all the unique species in an area, right? So bee richness. Next thing, here are all my fire characteristics that I studied. So here's the type of fire right here. Was it a wildfire or prescribed fire? Here's the seasonality of the fire. Was it a growing season fire or a dormant season fire? Here's the habitat of the fire. Was it a grassland? Was it a coniferous forest? Was it a broadleaf forest? Here's fire severity. You'll actually see that mid-severity fires are not here. It's because we didn't have enough data for mid-severity fires on bee richness, which I'll get to later. Here's the years post-fire. Were the studies done 0 years after the fire, basically the year of the fire? Was the study done 1 to 5 years after the fire? Was the study done from 6 to 10 and so forth? Here's fire frequency. Was there a single fire at a site? There should be a multiple fire at a site here, but you could see, again, we didn't have enough data for multiple fires at that one site. And then the overall fire effect. So bee richness, here are fire variables that, again, most scientists aren't considering. Next thing I want to draw your attention, here is the 0 effect line. Remember, effect is a big effect, is it a small effect? Is the effect going to increase bee richness or is it going to decrease bee richness? If anything is at the right side, here's the 0 effect. You could actually see the zeros right here. And you can see the numbers over here are positive. Again, positive increases. And the numbers here are negative. That means things decrease with a negative result. If anything's at the right of this 0 effect line, it means that it was positive. If anything up to the left of this, which means that it was negative and things were declining. And then what we have here are called whiskers. This is the randomness, the variation. These circles, keep in mind, are basically the mean, the median, the middle of the true effect. And I hope that made sense. So the result is this entire line here, and the true result, which we never could have in science, lands somewhere on this whisker, is what we call it. I hope that made sense. I'll still walk you through it. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the overall fire effect. So someone's saying, Steve, does just general fires, how do they affect bee richness? Well, they're on the right side of this line, and it significantly increases bee richness. And I say significantly because this whisker is completely over this zero effect line. So all the colors that you see here, if it's blue or orange, who cares about the colors? But if it's blue or orange, that means it's completely over the zero effect line. If it's gray, it's touching the zero effect line. I hope you're still with me. So because this is completely over the zero effect line, this means that in general, B richness will increase after fires. Okay? But now we're going to go more specific into the fires. We're going to look at wildfire versus prescribed fire. Both of these effects, these whiskers, are touching the zero effect line. Because they're touching the zero effect line, it means there's no result, there's no effect. It's neither positive nor negative. Because the true result could be right here. You see my mouse? It could be negative, but the true result also could be positive on the right side of the line. But because it's touching that line, we can't say it's either increasing or decreasing. But when a land manager comes to me, says, Steve, what's the difference between a wildfire and prescribed fire and B richness? I'm going to say there's no difference because they're both touching the line. There is no difference between a wildfire and a prescribed fire. I hope that made sense. A manager comes to me and goes, Steve, we just had a wildfire in Yellowstone National Park. How is that going to, well, let's go back here. A wildfire in Yellowstone National Park. How is that going to affect B richness? There's going to be no effect. The wildfire is not going to hurt or help B richness. If they go, Steve, what about seasonality? Is seasonality going to affect B richness? Both of these lines are significantly positive. Both of these lines are on the right side of this zero effect line, right? These whiskers, right, completely over. They're not touching. They basically both increase B richness. Growing season fires and dormant season fires, they positively increase B richness. There is no difference between either of them because they both help B richness. If we look at habitat of the fire, Steve, what about habitats of fire? If a fire is in a broadleaf forest, there's no effect. It's neither positive or negative because this is touching the line. For grasslands, if a fire was in a grassland, it's neither positive or negative because this whisker is touching the line here. However, you guys probably could see this. This effect right here is completely over the zero effect line. So that means it's significantly increased. So if you have a fire in a coniferous forest, it's going to significantly increase B richness. But a fire in a broadleaf forest and a fire in a grassland is going to have no effect. And I hope that made sense. If we look at fire severity completely over the zero effect line for low severity. That means low severity fires will significantly increase B richness. High severity fires have no effect. It's neither positive nor negative. So if you're managing for B richness, I would recommend you do a low severity fire because it's going to increase B richness. If we look at the years post-fire, 0 years of the fire, so the year of the fire, and 11 years after the fire, if you're doing a study, have no effect, but 1 to 5 years and 6 to 10 years significantly increase B richness. I hope that made sense because they were both completely over the zero effect line. An individual fire at a site will significantly increase B richness because it's completely over the line. That was a lot. I'm sorry, but I hope you know how to read a forest plot now. That was just B richness. I'm not going to go over each one with you, but if we look at B abundance, you could actually see almost all of these are colored. B abundance in general, no matter what type of fire it is going to increase because they're almost all over this zero effect line. I hope that made sense. If we switch taxa, if we look at ground beetles mostly have no effect. Fires in general mostly have no effect on ground beetle richness, but almost all of these median, the middle effect of these whiskers are on the right side of the line. This basically shows that fires, no matter what type, if we had more data, would actually increase ground beetle richness, no matter what type of fire it is or fire and site characteristic. But have this picture, right? Everything's mostly on the right side of the line. If we look at ground beetle abundance, they're almost on the left side of the line. So this is basically showing that if we look at ground beetles as community to individual fires, their richness would increase, but their abundance is actually going to decrease. I'll do that again. Almost everything, ground beetle richness, right side of the zero effect line. abundance left side of the zero effect line, which is very interesting. And now, if we actually go to butterflies, we have a lot of gray area. So a lot of this gray is actually touching the zero effect line, which means there's no effect. But one thing I want to mention to you guys is that these whiskers, look how long this variation is. This is basically saying we just need more data. We need more data, or butterflies is too big of a category. We always lump butterflies together, but remember, they're a suborder. I'm pretty sure if we went to family level of butterflies, these whiskers would be telling a much more accurate story. So, but based off of this, if a land manager goes, hey, Steve, well, is there a difference between wildfire and prescribed fire? I want to actually be on butterfly richness. I'm going to be like, there is no effect on butterfly richness between wildfire and prescribed fire because they both have no effect. The only thing significantly positive here is coniferous forest. And this is a very short variation line. So this is a pretty accurate result, I would say, that fires in coniferous forests will increase butterfly richness. I hope that made sense. But most of these things are all gray, so no effect. And sometimes they're on the right side of the line, the zero effect line, other times they're on the left. Here's 2 on the right, here's another one on the right, another one on the right, 2 on the left. Butterflies, I wrote it in the paper. If you're managing for butterflies, we really need to look at the family level or the individual species. Looking at the butterfly community is just too broad. Just throwing that out there. So that's butterfly richness. And if we look at butterfly abundance, it's more or less the same thing. We have large effect lines, almost all gray, which show no effect. And going back to coniferous forests, interestingly, for butterfly abundance, if you're having a fire in a coniferous forest, it's going to significantly decrease butterfly abundance. But if you look at butterfly richness, it actually increases in a coniferous forest, which is kind of cool. Almost the same pattern as the ground beetles, but as a community. So that's butterflies. Again, butterflies, looking at the community level, we really need to go down to the family to get more accurate results, better management as well, if you go down to the family level or even species level. Okay, so this is a figure, don't be scared of it, that summarizes all those forest plots that I showed you, right? So here are all our fire types, fire and site characteristics. Here's wildfire, prescribed fire, seasonality, habitat, severity, right? Here they are. Here's bee richness, ground beetle richness, and butterfly richness. So we're all looking at richness here, and we're all looking at abundance here. And if you see, if it's positive and colored, you could actually see if it was a positive effect or negative effect. And if it's significant, it would be blue or orange. If it was not significant, would show no effect, it would be gray. But there are 3 things I want you guys to take away from this. The first thing I want you to take away is, Steve, what are these black things right here? What do the black mean? So if we actually see, here's a mid-severity fire. For bee richness, it's black. It means we did not have enough data to do our meta-analysis. So these black areas are data gaps that we don't have in the pyroentomology field. So if you want to make a name for yourself in pyroentomology, here are the data gaps that you should be focusing on. So unsurprisingly, for 6 to 10 years, we have a lot of black here. So that means we don't have a lot of long-term studies when it comes to ground beetle richness, butterfly richness, ground beetle abundance, and butterfly abundance. We don't have long-term data in those, but these black areas, just not enough data in general. So first thing I want to take to keep in mind. Second thing I want you to take in mind, if you guys look at the colored parts right here on all the richness, so this left side is the bee richness, ground beetle richness, and butterfly richness, right? This side's abundance, this side's richness. All the significant results that we got was all positive. So you could actually see significantly positive, significantly positive, significantly positive, significantly positive. This is basically saying that no matter what type of fire it is, it's going to significantly increase richness. We did not have any results that showed that species richness would decrease after fire. We had results, for example, butterfly abundance would significantly decrease after a fire, but that's abundance. When we just look at richness, we found no results that any species richness would significantly decrease. Hope that made sense. And the third thing I want to leave you guys with is, I won't tell the story, but one reason why I did multiple taxa for this study was to see if there's any universal traits. And I got kind of close to a universal trait. I mean, a universal trait that would, it doesn't matter what type of insect you're studying. If you're, say, in a coniferous forest, would it actually matter what taxa you're studying if it would increase or decrease richness? And coniferous forest, I think, is a universal trait, because a coniferous forest significantly increased bee richness, it significantly increased butterfly richness, and the median for ground beetle richness was positive as well. So there are some universal traits here. If we look at, let's say, dormant season fires, if you have a fire in the dormant season, significantly increased bee richness, significantly increased ground beetle richness, and butterfly richness, even though it wasn't significant, it was still leaning towards positive. So here we have some universal traits that would help land managers and say that if we're going to have a fire, let's hope it's in the dormant season because it significantly increased stuff, the taxa that Steve studied. Hope that made sense. So 3 takeaways. Recapping 3 takeaways. The black here, data gaps. Have no idea, don't have a lot of information. We need more scientists studying those data gaps, which are the black. The second thing, we found no evidence that any type of fire characteristic would significantly decrease richness for any of our taxa. The third thing, some universal traits that we have, let's say a dormant season fire and coniferous forests as well. Won't go over this one, but just because I know there's a lot of controversy when it comes to land management in the Northeast, I actually did in this meta-analysis, I looked at different types of land management coupled with fire, right? So I looked at grazing plus fire, I looked at mowing plus fire, I looked at thinning plus fire, clear cutting plus fire, and just overall fire treatment, overall treatment plus fire. And I found there's a lot of data gaps, first of all, because you could see all this black here. But second of all, I found nothing that decreased species richness or abundance of these taxa that I studied when it came to land management. Conclusions, let me look at the time. Okay, conclusions, there's a lot of conclusions. I'm just gonna wrap it up relatively quick. But for bees, bee richness, bees in general benefit from all types of fire. Their species richness and abundance usually increase no matter what type of fire or site characteristic it is. This is mainly because most bees are solitary and most bees nest in open ground and dead wood. 2 things that you get a lot of after a fire, right? For ground beetles in general, their species richness increased after a fire, but their abundance decreased after a fire. Richness increased after a fire because you have more open area. You're getting early colonizers in that are coexisting with the survivors of the fire. But their abundance decreased because you're getting a lot of consumption of the individuals that were there after a fire. They could not flee the fire. So that's probably why the ground beetle abundance decreased. And again, for butterflies is, I know we like butterflies. I started out with butterflies. My first publication was on butterflies. When we look at butterflies, it's too broad of a community. We really have to get down to the family level, genus, or even species level. And universal traits, coniferous forests and mid-severity fire could be universal traits. I mentioned dormant season fire as well. So again, it doesn't matter what taxa you are. I'm betting that if you have a fire in a coniferous forests are usually fire adapted. Pine forests, for example, would increase species richness no matter what insect you are. And if you guys remember in the summary statistics, I mentioned only 7% of the pyroentomology literature out there actually quantified their fire severity. That is a huge problem in any type of fire ecology paper. It doesn't have to be with insects. If you're studying fire, you need to quantify your fire severity. And then just conservation implications. With the meta-analysis, we're making more accurate predictions to help conservation managers with the meta-analysis. We could guide conservation managers on when and what fire frequency and severity to use, because now we have data on specific taxa on fire severity, for example, and what severity should they aim for when they're using prescribed fire. In the meta-analysis, I provided a collective list of all the pyroentomology studies that I found. All 292 fire and butterfly, fire and bee, and fire and ground beetle research is in one area now. I identified knowledge gaps on where we need to learn more. And this also could make better predictions on other insect taxa, let's say grasshoppers, for example, that I actually didn't study. And what do we got here? Last slide. Again, the meta-analysis was on the global scale. I took all the research in the world, combined them into one data set to make predictions. I use that meta-analysis to make my own predictions in the New Jersey Pine Barrens on ground beetles. And it just so happens so far that the meta-analysis model and the predictions that it made to help with the local scale is actually being supported in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which is what I wanted. So I put my meta-analysis to the test and it's working. And I'm not sure if there's any tiger beetle enthusiasts here. Wade, if you're still here, I know you like your ghost tiger beetle in the Pine Barrens, but this is Cicindela patcherella, the Northern Barrens tiger beetle. It's one, I would say it's more rare than the ghost tiger beetle. And this thing loves fire because I found them all in my fire plots, but none in my unburned plots. So just throwing that out there. So with that, any questions? Here's my Instagram. Here's my collaborators' Instagram and Twitter. And of course, I'm very open to any communication via email or just message me on Instagram or something. But with that, any questions? I don't know how my length was, but I think we're close. Thanks for having me.
You're perfect. Does anyone have any questions for Steve? If you do, please unmute.
And I'll keep my screen share up just in case I need to go back to any slides.
I see there was a question. How is fire severity quantified? Is it by amount of area burned? That was in the chat.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to quantify fire severity. Let me get back. So maybe I should just escape and then go back. I'm almost close. Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to quantify fire severity. In general, the two ways are you could do satellite imagery or you could do ground truthing, right? So satellite imagery is you take a photo before a fire and then after the fire, and you could basically measure the amount of green with light from the satellite and the height of that, and the height using LiDAR, light radar, LiDAR, the height of the vegetation to see how much was consumed. So that's the satellite way of doing it. Ground truthing, again, is you literally go to the site and you measure percent canopy consumption, percent ground cover consumption, how much mineral soil is exposed, how far was the burn scars up the tree trunk. So the ground truthing is a lot harder, but it's more accurate. And this map right here of my field sites in the Pine Barrens that I tested in my meta-analysis, this was almost entirely, it was actually a mix. It was ground truthing and satellite imagery, and we overlaid them together to do that. I hope that answered your question.
Don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anyone else have a question for Steve? There's a lot of information there.
It was. And again, the goal was, if you're interested, you could read the paper, hopefully. Hope I'm not trying to sell myself, but most people, I think, if they see a forest plot for the first time and don't know how to work themselves through it, they just ignore everything. So at least this way, hopefully you got a foundation with that. And then I could at least do one of these and stop sharing so I could see you guys. Stop video. No, that was me. Let's see. Here we go. Stop sharing. There we go. Anyway, now I can see everybody.
So do we have any other questions? I'm just going to scroll through. Just unmute yourself if you do.
I'll take it to the chat.
Here. Come on.
Yeah, one more in your charts there where you had a line with a dot in the middle. Presumably that line represented some sort of a variable curve, a bell-shaped curve or something else like that. It's a little bit hard to translate that kind of information into a line.
Yeah, so one thing about a meta-analysis, so when you say a bell-shaped curve, you're thinking about normalizing the data like a normal distribution?
Well, there will be some kind of a distribution.
Right. So with a meta-analysis, we're not using the normal frequentist statistics that have a normal distribution. So I did not have to hit normality when I made those figures, if that made sense.
Okay, so basically what you were shown a range where this occurred and your dot is in the middle.
Let me
And
get it.
so sometime, you know, that was some sort of a distribution, but it's not, the information isn't there.
I wouldn't say it's a distribution. I would think it's just, here's all the data. Can you guys see this when I
Yeah.
shared? So out of 25 effects that we could get on wildfires and on bee abundance, the true effect is somewhere in this line. So don't think about it as distribution. We basically combined all their data to find one true effect, and the effect is somewhere in here.
Mhm.
And because it was completely over the zero effect line and completely over on the right side, it means the true effect is somewhere positive, which increases bee abundance.
Just say.
Yep, fine, thank you.
Okay, sorry if I didn't explain it that well, but we didn't use normality to do a meta-analysis.
More questions? Okay. I think there's a lot of information for us to absorb there, but we do have your email. So obviously, if people want to reach out to Steve, if you come up with a question afterwards.
Yeah, and I like, Lee, you mentioned the use of metadata. And I could not do this without other scientists sharing their data. And for whatever it's worth, I know colleagues that use eBird data, that are using citizen science data. And they're, that's information that goes up in the cloud somewhere. Scientists, macro data people, big data people, they use that information to really solve global questions. So this is, I'm more of a local ecologist. I care on a smaller scale in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. This is one of probably the few times I'm looking at a global scale, if that made sense. And I used metadata to do this meta-analysis. And I tested it at the local scale. And how is fire severity quantified? I think you asked that, Donna. Great presentation, thanks. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm you guys too much. And thank you, Maria, for explaining richness and abundance. So I think when we do NAB account,